Good afternoon and welcome to the ASID Interior Design Billings Index first quarter report and webinar for 2019. This webinar will include the results from the IDBI from January 2019 to March 2019, including the bonus questions that we ask our panel. We have with us Jack Kleinhans, our chief economist from Kleinhans and Associates, who will give us the overview and also some of the specifics of how the interior design business performance is doing. And then we also have today debuting his presentations, Eric Lynch, Senior Associate of Research here at ASID, who will be presenting on the bonus questions that we ask the panel each month. Also wanted to say that the 2019 first quarter report is included as a handout to this webinar. So if you would like to read along as Jack and Eric present on the first quarter findings, please do so. And at the end of the recording, we will also be sending the webinar recording and the quarterly report out to the media as well. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Jack to present on the first quarter results. Jack?
Thanks, Susan. It's a pleasure to be with you again. Let's stand back for a minute from an overview and look at what's happened. Over the past few months, we've seen a dramatic period for the nation's economy. There are many moving parts, and we've seen a rebound in many indicators showing the economy actually is in a good place. And I think that today's presentation, at least with the data that we received for the first quarter, is very consistent with that performance. I think consumer fundamentals, including job growth and wage growth and a healthy balance sheet, should support interior design spending in this forthcoming year. So on the first slide, what we presented is the Interior Design Billing and Inquiries Index. We saw a healthy increase in the first quarter, looking at basically the IDBI Index 3-month moving average, which gives us a little bit better understanding of the ups and downs, even though the monthly index of 60.4 happened to be the strongest that we've seen in several quarters. There was a definite slowing earlier in the months in the first quarter, and that might be due in part to the slowing that we saw in the soft first couple of months that the rest of the economy experienced. Now, the new project 3-month moving average was 56.0. That's the red line as shown in our graph. It's complementary to certainly the billing index, and I think it shows in both cases that business conditions are expanding. And I just want to note for all our listeners that we are now presenting all the data in a seasonally adjusted format. And with that, let's go to the next slide. By mentioning the seasonal adjustment, we wanted really to emphasize that there are situations in the industry that are reoccurring within a year and across years. So to help us understand what the direction and the magnitude of the changes, we have had enough data now going back to the inception of the survey to be able to seasonally adjust the data. So you can see in this case an example of what we're seeing the difference between regular data, or I should say unadjusted data, that would be the blue line, and the red line, which is the seasonally adjusted data. So the blue line was up for March, which certainly is a good signal, but it was also, the red line is telling us that, yeah, we should have an up month. And we go back in time that typically March is early summer, late spring, or if you want to say the end of the first quarter. We have a tendency in the industry to actually see a kick up in billings. We don't know exactly what the cause of it is. It could be a number of forces. People's plans going forward into the more heavy construction and home improvement time of the year could be one. It could be also associated with the timing of tax refunds that usually occur in February and March. As everybody has noticed, they've been a little bit lower than last year, but still sizably several thousands of dollars, which could be the ability for people to spend in the industry. If we go to the next slide, basically we're going to look at the same seasonally adjusted analysis for the inquiries. Basically, we had an uptick in inquiries, the blue line, and our red line is saying, well, typically we should have an uptick. Likewise, if we go back just a couple of months into December, inquiries should have been down, and yet they were down even more so. If you look at the unadjusted data, they were down considerably, but when we have adjusted for it, we shouldn't take and be so concerned that it typically happens at that time of the year. So what we've noticed here is basically reoccurring periods, months during the annual cycle that certain months are heavier than others. And I think that bears out, and it makes perfect sense given the type of work and the timing of billings and interest by consumers as well as commercial enterprises. So let's go right to the next slide, please. And this basically outlines how the different size firms have been performing, and most recently, again, seasonally adjusted. And it shows the results on a 3-month moving average. Now, looking at billing seasonally adjusted for sole practitioners, and that's the blue line, and the red line, which is the smaller firms, we see actually some steadiness throughout time, a little bit more so than what with the purple, which is the largest firms, and the green, which is even the larger mid-sized firms. But nonetheless, the red line is showing an uptick from above 50, which is an expansionary range. We had a 53.5 score at the end of March, 3-month moving average, excuse me. And then the green line, which is, as I mentioned, the sole practitioner, we also have indicated an increase building up during the previous slowdown. Now, the sole practitioner recorded, I'm sorry, let me just go back one more time. The 10 to 24 size firm recorded a 50.1, which is the green line, which indicates an increase. Still, that we're seeing a positive business conditions. On the other hand, sole practitioners recorded a score of 47.5, which compares to the 52 that we saw at the end of the fourth quarter. So softening a little bit at that size group. And then the larger firms certainly rebounded from 33 that we recorded late in the fourth quarter up to 50 for the first quarter. The next slide is the 3-month moving average for the ASID for the billing index. A little bit steadier work in terms of the data. It's a snapshot of how we see things perhaps in the pipeline. And we can look across, this is the billing index for the 3-month moving average. Excuse me, but would you stop making the pointer move around? Thank you. Well, looking across regions, the interior designs firm really reported increased activity during the first 3 months, all above 50. And you might wonder why is it that we see this condition across regions, but then when we see different size firms, and then we also see, even back to our earlier slides, some more volatility. In part, the volatility is coming basically coming from some of the larger firms in the overall index. But as you can see, once we smooth it out by region, the volatility doesn't move as much, at least in the last, say, 6 months. The green line is important. It's in the south. It's actually come up. It showed considerable improvement from the end of the third quarter, in fact. But then we look at the other regions, they're all doing pretty reasonably fine to end the first quarter. The next slide gives us a little indication on how we are doing as an industry relative to the demand by consumers when they spend on furniture and durable goods. This comes from the Bureau of Economic Analysis that breaks out consumer spending. And let's stand back just for a moment, because when we think about personal consumption expenditures, 70% or about that is used for services, and 30% is for goods. And so some portion of that goods is being directed towards spending on furniture and durable goods. And you can see in the fourth quarter, as well as in the first quarter, on a year-over-year basis, it has been down compared to the early part of 2018, and actually going back for several years into 2017. So we saw a pickup and a pretty steady growth rate. Now, it's still expanding, as we see, but it has slowed down. Now, this partial slowdown might be due to a number of reasons. I think the fourth quarter and parts of the first quarter might have been due to the weakness in housing and the increase in interest rates because of the Fed kick-up. And we also had the shutdown. So it probably created some anxiety over consumer decisions in terms of making spending for any type of large items like cars or furniture, etc. So thinking forward, I believe that with the other data that we're seeing from our survey, we should see this picking up perhaps in the next quarter, hopefully, and that'll also be very good in terms of the overall economic activity. But notice again, the green line is our inquiries. That's a positive sign that our firms are looking at some possible services to be had in the future. The next slide that we've prepared goes into more detail about what's going on by the sectors. The housing sector shows a significant improvement. That would be the multifamily, the green line and the purple line. It has picked up since the end of the second quarter. Again, I think this relates to the softness and the weakness in the housing sector to a degree. We know that rates increased, and so people's borrowing for mortgages or even consumer loans may have been somewhat of a speed bump in terms of determining a decision on undertaking some interior design. Now, on the other hand, looking at the commercial and institutional purpose, there has been a slowing throughout 2018. Our most recent, I shouldn't say the most recent reading, but the reading at the end of the first quarter was for institutional at 47.9 and commercial 48.8. So not too far from an expanding industry, but yet still far enough to say that the business is not doing as well as we saw at times in previous years. Now let's go to the next slide, which gives us another facet on this prism of spending by consumers and by businesses for retail interior design. For interior design. This residential improvement spending comes from construction data. The last time we had this webinar, this data was not available because of the partial government shutdown that occurred, and it was delayed considerably. And it did show, once we had the data, that a very positive growth was taking place on a year-over-year basis. This is money that's not spent for multifamily or not spent for single-family home construction. It's data, what we call home improvement data. and the amount was approximately 208 million in February, and it's about 7% higher than December. You can see if you compare that to December, but it is a little bit lower than where it was on a year-over-year basis. It's about 1% less than what February of 18 showed. Now, the Harvard Housing Studies Report, which we commented in our first quarter document, reported that they expect a 5% growth rate that had been occurring in this area of home improvement to slow down, largely because we really are in the tail end, or probably further into our expansion, and that usually happens where home improvement and repair spending tends to fall off. But that doesn't mean necessarily that while it's fallen off, it will stop. And I think that's a very important conclusion that we ought to make from their report. Now, finally, I'd like to comment on the outlook for the next 6 months that we've received from our panelists. This indicator is basically looking at 3 different reports. The panelists are asked by the ASID in their survey what is their outlook for the next 6 months. The conference board has a survey question and asks consumers what their expectations are for the next 6 months. And the Dodge Momentum Index is basically one that is a leading index for commercial non-residential spending. So we're all kind of looking at the outlook at the same sort of endpoint, if you will. And you can see that the consumer using the Conference Board Expectation Index remained elevated at 99.8. Actually, I just looked it up because this was for the end of March. If we use the April data, which is not shown, it turned out to be 98.3, and it's actually 103 for the month of April. And so that's a good indication that we're seeing better conditions. The blue line, which is our panelists, also look to be fairly optimistic with a expectation over the next 6 months. 93% of our panelists said they believe it'd be same or better in the next 6 months, and it's really the best outlook we've had based on that indicator since last June. And then finally, looking at the green line, which I mentioned is the Dodge Momentum Index, it's about 145.5. It's somewhat unchanged from December, but nonetheless, it remains elevated, which I think is a good indication that the construction cycle that they're involved with will continue to be really in a good pace going forward. Certainly, there are going to be pressures, as we see for every other industry, given where the economy is, but the outlook, I think, is very positive across these indicators. And with that, I will turn over the presentations to Eric.
All right, thanks, Jack. And again, thank you all for attending. So the bonus questions for the first quarter of 2019, we structured around the topic of investments. So the first question that you'll see here on the slides here is dealing with what percent of individuals expect an increase in their salary for 2019. And as you can see here on the slides, that an overwhelming 51% of individuals on our panelists mentioned that they do not anticipate a raise occurring in 2019. Now, this also aligns with what the Bureau of Labor Statistics published recently with regards to wage growth. As of May 2018, which is the most recent data for this, they estimated that the annual mean wage change year over year was about 2.6%. While looking a little bit more granularly at interior designers, it was about a whole percentage point lower at 1.6%. So again, our panelists are seeing similar instances with regards to their pay. And just as a brief kind of primer with regards to what year-over-year calculation refers to, And that refers to a defined period like a month or a quarter that you're comparing over consecutive years. Like in our instance here, we're comparing 2019 to 2018 and vice versa. And just to give a little heads up as well, ASID conducted a larger survey back in 2018, which also found similar results with regards to the percentage of pay increases. However, though, the report also details more information, such as details about salaries, benefits, and satisfaction. So be on the lookout where ASID is planning to release this general report in the next couple of weeks. So as I mentioned, when analyzing the year-over-year change, again, this is 2019 compared to 2018, where we asked a similar question of our panelists, you notice that there is a big change between those who marked themselves as 0% and expecting a raise of 3%, but very positive gains kind of towards the mid-level around 5%, and then also towards the higher end level at about 25%. Now, even though there was an upswing in the number of panelists not anticipating raises, this could potentially also be explained by maybe one of the other bonus questions that we asked, so not necessarily about your salary, but potentially about the investments that you have with your business. So the other question that we asked of our panelists this particular quarter was if they decided to increase any investment in their company for the first quarter. And as you can tell, again, it's still a majority of individuals are not planning to make any additional investments at around 45%. However, though, as you can tell, their small and moderate categories are about 17% individually. So with that as well, a question we wanted to add in tandem with it was whether or not these individuals decided to make these investments based on the new tax legislation that passed back in 2017. And as indicated here, an overwhelming majority of individuals, close to 90%, stated that the tax legislation did not influence the decision-making process when it came to investments for their business. Now, this is also, again, a comparison of year-over-year changes with regards to both the questions that you saw on the previous slide. So the number of individuals who indicated no investments made did decrease. However, again, also small and moderate also noticed some increases as well year over year. Now, with regards to the tax legislation question, you can see that there is both an increase in the amount of no responses and a decrease in the number of yes responses. So based on kind of what we're seeing from our panelists here, the benefits with regards to the tax legislation of December of 2017 is getting further and further in the rearview mirror when it comes to investments made by our panelists into the businesses. Now, taking that a little bit step further, we understand that we have individuals that make investments into the business, but we wanted to understand how much or the amount of investment that are they making into their businesses. And as you can see by the chart here, an overwhelming majority of our panelists are not only making the most number of investments in the 1,000 to 4,999 category, but the total invested amount based on a weighted average is also the greatest in this category. Now, when we were looking at the weighted amount with regards to investment average, take a look at the categories of 10,000 to 19,099 and the 50,000 or more categories. Now, you can tell that both these categories have the same number of individuals who responded, but you notice the 50,000 or more category has a higher total investment amount rather than the 10,000 to 19,999. That's to take into account that even though you have the same number of investments in each category, an individual who is investing over 50,000 is going to be weighted a little bit differently than an individual indicating an investment under 20,000. So that is what the red line is also indicating as well with regards to the total amount invested. Now, if we remember from the previous slide, I mentioned that the small and moderate categories had the same number of individuals respond at both 17%. However, though, you noticed again 1,000 to 4,999 as the overwhelmingly most individuals into their category. Now, that could be a little bit subjective. That, let's say, for example, I'm an individual who is a sole proprietor and I'm making a small investment. What I classify as a small investment might be different than another individual of a larger company with more individuals. So to take into account from that, that's most likely one of the reasons why the individuals in that category mark themselves as such with regards to the investment. Now, looking at the average amount per investment, the total weighted average was a little over $6,000 for each investment. Now, to finish up with regards to investment, we wanted to take a look at what resources our panelists are using in order to promote the growth and expansion of their business. Now, as you can tell by the graph here, majority of our panelists are looking for more face-to-face or personal interactions when it comes to the resources, such as networking opportunities that include chapter events, industry events, and the such, and including as well industry representatives and showrooms. So even though we're noticing an increase in the amount of technology that firms are going to utilize every year, the best resources that our panelists are using, again, are more face-to-face and personal interactions. There also appears to be an emphasis as well on ASID materials rather than some other outlets or resources, such as other interior design publications, trade magazines, or national economic outlets like the Bureau of Labor Statistics or the U.S. Census Bureau. So again, as I mentioned, our panelists appear to want to interact more with an individual face-to-face rather than other publications or other technologies. So that is an overview of the bonus questions that we have for this quarter. And with that, I am going to return the baton back over to Susan.
Okay, thank you, Eric, and also thank you, Jack, for giving us the report on the first quarter of 2019. I'm still amazed that we're at the end of May already. So time is definitely going by as quickly as it seems to be, but it's great to kind of take a moment to look back at how we've been doing during the first quarter to kind of get a pulse on what's to come, as Jack referred to for the 6-month outlook. Just a question that I had as I was hearing both Jack and Eric present is Eric had mentioned about pay raise, the expectation for it to increase. I'm just seeing overall that business has been doing well, both for investments in human personnel and also in investments for software and hardware. And I know, Jack, you included this in the quarterly report, but I was wondering if you could kind of, as we wrap up this session, comment on how interior design employment or construction employment is doing.
Well, yes, in our report, we actually show architectural design services and interior design, the change in monthly jobs. And looking at the time we had the report, there was no March data. And unfortunately, I don't have the March data at my fingertips. But we did see in February that the architectural industry added approximately 7,300 jobs in February, and we also saw about 800 jobs specifically in the interior design services. So an uptick in growth in both sectors. There was a little bit of a downturn in job growth in the month of January in terms of negative, and it was the first negative we saw in interior design. And I think it's really kind of just one of those things that fell out of the data. And the reason why I say that is because the January data that was released by several of the agencies was suspect. So I'm not big concerned about the downtick for interior design. Now, in terms of wages, I look at the average hourly earnings generally across industries, and we've seen some improvement, not significant though. Average hourly earnings for the first quarter was up 3.3%, and that was about the same where it was at the end of the fourth quarter. Now, another indicator is the Employment Cost Index, which is a broader and actually a better indicator of how wages are, and that was up 3%, actually a nudge down from the third quarter. I think what we have to do is compare it to where we think it ought to be. And at this point in the expansion, average hourly earnings and the Employment Cost Index should be around 3.4, 3.5. So wages really haven't necessarily caught up with sort of the expectations, although it's improving. Obviously, it would be a great boost to everybody to have a little bit more dollars in their wallet to spend.
Thank you, Jack. It's overall great to hear that it is so far going towards a positive trend, although we do still have a couple ways to go to catch up. But overall, glad to hear that things are doing well for the interior design business. That is the end of this webinar. Time has, again, even for this webinar, time has flown by. So we are at the 30-minute mark. Thank you for attending this webinar. And for those who are listening to the recording, thank you for downloading the recording and hearing the results for the first quarter IDBI results. If you have any additional questions about the report or this IDBI project in general, please contact Lori Insignia, Director of Marketing and Communications, and she will direct your questions to the appropriate person. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of the day.